Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kritzas, and I am a counseling psychologist and the education director at LightHouse Arabia. A warm welcome to all attending the webinar on Your Child's Mind Matters. Just a few general housekeeping things that I would like to settle before we get started. Can I see a show of virtual hands? How many of you can see and hear me clearly? Wonderful. So the way this webinar will run today is for the first 45 minutes, I will be sharing a deck with you and I will be presenting on this topic at hand. And then the last 15 minutes, I will put aside for any questions that you may have. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A section and I will address it at the end of our webinar in the Q&A 15-minute time slot. And if you just allow me a moment now, I'm going to share my screen with you. And this webinar will be recorded and will be shared with you post session today. So I'm going to quickly share my screen with all of you. And what we see here is that we are speaking about a very pertinent topic in society. And what we know is that half of mental health illnesses begin at age 14 years. And so this is why we are speaking about this today. So before we get started, I'd just like to share a bit about the LightHouse Arabia. We are a mental health and wellbeing center located in central Dubai, and we offer psychological services and psychiatric care to individuals across the lifespan. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we've taken majority of our services online. We have support groups running. We have community at the heart of everything that we do at Lighthouse, and we're also home to the Rami Grief Center, which is the only free of cost grief support service in the region. So that is us in a nutshell. And today's agenda is as follows. We're going to be unpacking what mental health is and looking at the difference between sadness and depression, the difference between normal worry and anxiety. We're also going to be looking at how you as parents can safeguard your child's mental health and well-being, and how we can go forward and support our children when they're dealing with mental health difficulties. So I am, always very, very excited to be able to speak about such a pertinent topic. Over the past 12 years that I've been working in private practice, I've worked extensively with children and families around the topic and around the issues of depression, anxiety, stress. I myself have my own relationship with anxiety from a very young age. So when I do share these evidence-based strategies with you today, I want you to know that it comes from professional practice as well as personal practice. Right. So why are we speaking about this right now? Well, if we just think about the fact that we have been in a global pandemic over the past 10 months or so, that I think it is important that we have mental health front and center of the discussions we're having these days, because we are all grieving the loss of different things at different times. And for our children in particular, they've had to adjust, and had to exercise their flexibility muscles more than ever before. And they've had to grieve the loss of certain experiences that they had last year, that this year they were unable to carry through. They are having to adjust to different safety protocols within schools. They are having to adjust to blended learning. Some are having to adjust to working from home and not being able to go into school and see their friends. So a lot of these children are grieving the common experiences that they had pre-pandemic. And then what we know is that this pandemic that has just hit us is now existing on an epidemic of poor mental health. And what we also see is that there's been increase in online engagement with our children. A lot of children are spending more time online now than ever before because of restrictions that have been placed on them. And then also finding themselves feeling quite isolated because, they are now spending more time online. They are not getting that face-to-face interaction with their peers, which we know is critical to their development. So this is why we are speaking about this at the moment. And what we know is that according to the World Health Organization, 20% of children and adolescents worldwide are experiencing a mental health disorder. So 1 in 5 children are experiencing a mental health illness. And when you think of 1 in 5, I want you to think of 1 in 5 children in your child's football team, 1 in 5 children in your child's classroom, 1 in 5 children when your child goes to a birthday party are struggling with a mental health difficulty. Okay, so it is not anymore something that is only happening to other people. It is happening around us. And what we know about adults is that 1 in 4 people are struggling with a mental health disorder. So 1 in 4 people in your workplace, in your organizations, in your family, even on this webinar today, are struggling with mental health difficulties. And what we know is that half of mental illnesses begin by the age of 14. And so this is why early detection is really important. And what we know as well is that the World Health Organization has stated suicide as being the 3rd leading cause of death amongst adolescents worldwide. So this is why we are speaking about this today. We also know that in studies that they've done, 51% of 9 to 10-year-olds are feel better about themselves when they're on a diet. And so we're finding that children as young as 9 and 10 have body image issues. And we're finding that more and more children are being brought into the hospital setting, into the emergency unit for psychiatric related issues rather than physical issues. Okay, so another fact that I want to leave you with today is that the World Health Organization did a ranking where they placed physical illnesses alongside mental illnesses. And what they found was that disseminated breast cancer, which is when breast cancer has spread throughout the body, is as disabling to an individual's life as major depressive disorder. So somebody who is experiencing a major depression is faced with the same difficulties in life. It is as disruptive to their living as someone who is diagnosed with breast cancer. And so it's so important that we bring the mental health issues alongside physical health issues here and understand that they are equally important. So when we think about mental health, many times we think of it as quite a dirty word. It's something that people don't speak about. But what people need to understand is that mental health is synonymous with physical health. And mental health refers to the health of our thoughts, our feelings, and our general well-being. Just like we have physical health, we have mental health. And so mental health is something we all have, and it's something that we need to take care of. It's the health of our mind, our thoughts, our feelings, and it is on a continuum, which is flexible and forever changing. It is not something that only crazy or weak people have. It is not the same as mental illness, and it is not a fixed state. Okay, so what we see is that when a child's coping mechanisms are outweighed by their stresses and the scale tilts, they can easily be more vulnerable to experiencing an episode of anxiety or depression. Okay. And so when we think about mental health, I want us to think about it as falling on this continuum, with poor mental health on the one side of the continuum and good mental health on the other side of the continuum. Just like we have poor physical health some weeks and good physical health other weeks, we can have poor mental health some weeks where we are being super critical of ourselves, where we're not looking after our our self-care, that we're not making time for ourselves, that we're not finding moments to relax and switch off in our days. And then there may be days where we are experiencing good mental health, where we are feeling more grateful about things in our life, where we are making time for ourselves, where we are making time for our relationships in life. We know that, relationships are a great mitigator against stress. So we need to understand the difference here. And often when I work with parents, they will say things like, when will my child be free of this anxiety? And what I often share with parents is that your child has a relationship with anxiety, just like they have a relationship with sleep, just like they have a relationship with friends. And so they need to understand that this all or nothing approach needs to be put to rest, because we all have a relationship with anxiety. And if we have protective factors and good coping mechanisms in place, we're able to manage that relationship, and we're able to take control of that relationship, as opposed to allowing anxiety to control us. So it's important that we understand that instead of seeing it as all or nothing approach, you either have it or you don't, seeing it as having a relationship with these things in your life, just like you have a relationship with getting a cold or a flu. The same, we have a relationship with possibly picking up anxiety or depression based on our protective factors and our risk factors. And so I will speak a bit more about risk factors in a moment. And so what is a mental illness? When do we look to diagnose a child with clinical anxiety or clinical depression? What we need to see is any major changes to the child's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And the symptoms need to be persistent over time. They need to impair the child's functioning, and they interrupt the child's day-to-day living. And so when I'm looking to make a diagnosis of anxiety or depression, I'm looking for the severity, the frequency, and the duration of the symptoms present. Severity: are these symptoms mild, moderate, or severe? Frequency: how often is the child experiencing these symptoms? And then duration: how long has the child been experiencing these symptoms for? And then we look at, are these symptoms causing impairment in this child's day-to-day functioning, that the child is unable to sleep at night, the child doesn't want to go to school, the child is struggling to concentrate in the class, the child doesn't want to engage in extramural activities anymore, they're feeling indifferent about life, they're speaking about death and dying and suicide. And so there are multiple things that need to be in place in order for us to make a diagnosis. It's not something that we just decide because there are one or two symptoms present. And what we think mental illness looks like, we think that it's Eeyore with a dark cloud above his head, or someone sitting in the corner. But what we need to understand is that mental illness is quite invisible to the eye. And this is often what mental illness really looks like. Individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., who struggled with 2 suicide attempts and depression. Then we have Princess Diana, who struggled with an eating disorder. We have Michael Phelps, who is the most decorated Olympic athlete in history, who speaks about his struggle with depression. We have The Rock, who speaks about his struggle with anxiety and depression, and then the CEO of Tesla, Elon Musk, who has also been very open about his challenges with mental health. And I would say that often social media is a big culprit when it comes to how people are able to mask their true emotions, and how often social media portrays everybody as experiencing a perfect life when in actual fact people are struggling. So what I want to also say today is that children are masters at wearing masks. And I'm not referring to the COVID-19 masks, although kids have become pretty skilled at wearing those too. I'm referring to the masks that children wear as a means of hiding their true feelings, as a means of not sharing their vulnerabilities. And so it becomes really difficult to detect when a child may be struggling with a mental health difficulty. And that is why parents attending this webinar are really putting their child at the front and center of their minds, because mental health illnesses are invisible to the eye. And so educating ourselves on what are the key signs and symptoms that my child may be struggling is really critical in a time like today, right? So the importance of early detection, what we know is that if cancer is detected early, there will be a better prognosis for that individual. Same applies to anxiety and depression. And I've worked with some adults who have reported only getting diagnosed with clinical anxiety in their late 20s. And by that stage, they had already experienced 2 suicide attempts. They had already struggled with drug abuse and addiction because they didn't know that that was what they were experiencing. And so early detection is key because it can lead to better outcomes regarding their education, regarding their increased self-esteem and motivation, and it will have less negative impact on their health, right? The impact that we see that that mental health difficulties have on a child's physical health are quite vast. And what we know is that when a child is experiencing great stress in their life, it will then activate their fight or flight stress response. And what we know is that our fight or flight stress response is the very thing that protects us from danger. But what we know as well, according to Professor Robert Sapolsky from Stanford University, is that children are able to activate their fight or flight stress response through thought alone. They can just think about an upcoming test that they have, or the fact that they're going to be away from their parents, and they can activate that fight or flight stress response in their bodies. And when that happens, cortisol and adrenaline are released into the system. Blood leaves the smaller muscle groups and moves to the larger muscle groups so that the child can take flight. And their breathing becomes deeper, their heart rate increases during this time. What also happens is the body needs to reserve as much energy as possible. So it shuts down long-term projects like the digestive system, which uses up 30 to 40% of our energy. So it shuts down the digestive system in our kids. It shuts down the growth hormone in kids. It shuts down ovaries in women. And so what we see is that when we are experiencing stress for more days than not, over weeks on end, it can start playing out in the physical body of the child. And that is why some children will complain of gastrointestinal issues, sore tummies. They can even develop onset of type 2 diabetes. And so we need to understand that mental health starts to impact physical health. And we see that severe stress can affect the growth hormone, that some children even experience psychogenic dwarfism in more extreme cases where they are faced with environments where there's great stress in their life, that they actually stop growing. And so what we also know is that depression can worsen pain symptoms associated with physical illnesses. And now how do we know whether or not our child is at risk of developing a mental health difficulty. So there's several risk factors that I'm going to share with you. And there's often the nature versus nurture debate that we often hear people speaking about. You know, is it nature that has caused my child to experience a mental health difficulty due to genes? Or is it due to nurture, the environment that has brought about the anxiety or the depression? And I'm going to say it's a bit of both, okay? So here are some risk factors, biological risk factors that can put a child at risk. If there's a family history of mental illness, if there are physical illnesses or physical disabilities, if there are, you know, thyroid imbalances, if there's vitamin D deficiency. And then if we look at psychological risk factors, we know that, you know, children who are very critical of themselves are more at risk of developing anxiety and depression, because there is a strong correlation between self-criticism and anxiety and depression in individuals. We also know that, you know, children who have been labeled, whether it is being labeled by their peers or being labeled by their family, that can also impact their self-esteem, that can also impact how they see themselves in the world. Perfectionism is strongly linked to mental health difficulties as well, because nothing ever feels good enough. I'm never ever feeling like I'm good enough. I always try harder. I'm always comparing myself to others. Social risk factors, I would say that social media is one of the top risk factors, and technology. And the more time your child is spending online, the more they are then going to expose themselves to those difficulties around mental health. Because what we know is that there is the social comparison theory, and we know that individuals who are spending more time online are comparing themselves to others, and then the more they do that, the more unhappy they are with their own lives. So what we see here is that expat lifestyle can also be a risk factor. Children are often away from their immediate support networks, families back home. Even in a time now with the pandemic, some children haven't seen their grandparents for months on end, which takes them out of their normal rhythm of being. So these are just some of the risk factors. And what we know is that social media has led to a catastrophic sleep loss epidemic. And if I can say that, you know, we are faced with a sleep loss epidemic, and that is contributing to many of the mental health difficulties that we're seeing in youth today, because less than 7 hours of sleep is considered sleep deprivation. And some of these children are getting 5 hours or less of sleep because they're spending more and more time online. And so we also know that it is making children feel more isolated. Sherry Turkle, who is the author of Alone Together, speaks about how WhatsApp and all of these social media apps are making children feel as though they are able to control the amount of connection they have with people in their lives. So they are connected to people, but in amounts that they're able to control. And so what we're seeing is that children are spending less time face to face, more time online. They are not knowing how to engage with individuals face to face anymore. That some children are even showing signs of falling on the autism spectrum, when in actual fact they don't have a formal diagnosis, but they are not spending enough time socializing with their peers to be able to pick up on social cues. So these are some of the challenges faced. And what we see is that children are then falling prey to being bullied on social media platforms. What we know is that some children struggle with setting boundaries. Children do not have the etiquette needed to be on social media platforms. And I attended a conference in Los Angeles 2 years ago, and there was a lady speaking about the effects of social media. And she explained the following. She said, would you ever give your child the keys to a car at the age of 16 without teaching them how to drive the car and say, yeah, my darling, go and drive? Would you ever do that? No. You would first make sure that your child knows how to drive a car. You would teach them etiquette, rules of the road, etc. Why is it then that we are giving our children a smartphone and saying, here we go, my darling, use it? Because what we're seeing is that children are being given these devices, but they're not being taught how to use them. Neither are they being taught how to set healthy boundaries with them. So we need to understand that there needs to be more responsibility on our part when we are giving our children a device like a smartphone, because it is actually even more dangerous than a car, and it will take them to places just from the corners of their room. They can access corners of the world. They don't need a car these days to get to places that they want to get to. So let's just be aware of the effects of that. Where are children being cyberbullied? What we know is that 42% of kids are being bullied on Instagram, and then we see it follows Facebook and then Snapchat. So these are the three main platforms where children are being bullied the most. Okay. And then what we also see from the Ditch the Labels study is that there are several things that are being impacted when our child is spending time online. 41% of children develop social anxiety, 37% of children who spend time online develop depression, and 26% of children had suicidal thoughts. Okay? And I'm not going to go through the rest just due to time constraints, but you can have a look yourself at the effects of that. And so what are some warning signs that my child may be struggling? What we know is that children don't have the emotional vocabulary to be able to string together sentences around how they are actually feeling internally. And children are not like adults where they can come and sit on a couch and explain to you that I'm feeling a bit sad about this that happened to me or that happened to me. They don't have the cognitive capacity for that yet. And so what we need to be on the lookout for is any significant changes in our child's behavior. That should alert us to the fact that something is up and that something isn't feeling right. Because we're seeing that our child may be a bit withdrawn, they may be a bit more secretive, they may be quiet, they may be obsessing over things. We may also pick up on aggressive behaviors like, shouting or name calling or hitting. Regressive behaviors may also show up where the child may actually start, bedwetting. And we know that when a child has started wetting their bed after they've been potty trained, that this is then secondary enuresis, and this is related to emotional difficulty and not a physical difficulty. There may be changes in the child's sleep pattern. This is something that we're always on the lookout for. If a child is struggling to fall asleep or is not getting enough sleep, that should be a big enough warning sign for us, or major changes in their academic performance. So these are some things that we're looking out for when we want to understand if our child may be struggling. So what is clinical depression? I think it's important that we understand that often depression is used so loosely. This term is used very loosely in society. Children will say, I'm feeling depressed when they've just had a sad day. Some children struggle to sit with difficult emotions. And so, they will quickly label themselves as depressed, but it's important that they understand the difference. And what we know is that sadness is a normal human emotion. And if a child feels sad, they can still take pleasure in activities. Whereas depression is more pervasive, and it's a serious clinical condition. It lasts 2 weeks or more. The child no longer enjoys things that they once gave pleasure to. They may experience suicidal thoughts or behaviors. And so I want to share the symptoms of depression with you now. What we know is that the two key symptoms would be the first 2 bullet points that need to be present. A child will display a depressed mood that doesn't go away for more days than not, or the child may experience an irritable mood. Okay, that is something that we'll often see in children. And then they will experience a loss of interest in pleasurable activities. So things that they used to find pleasure in, they don't want to do anymore. Let's say your child loved going to dancing. All of a sudden, they don't want to dance anymore. Or they loved reading. They don't want to read anymore. So that's what we're on the lookout for there. When they are tearful more days than not, when they are feeling quite tired and lacking energy, that will then alert us to the fact that their sleep may be affected as well. So their sleeping difficulties, there may be changes in their appetite, either they're eating less or they're eating more. They may experience significant weight loss or significant weight gain. They may be experiencing difficulty concentrating. And so when a child is displaying symptoms of concentration difficulties, it's so important that we first rule out emotional difficulties, because I've often had parents bring their child in asking whether the child needs to be put on Ritalin or a stimulant medication. Does my child have an ADHD? And so we first need to rule out if there's depression or anxiety, because one of the key symptoms of depression or anxiety is concentration difficulties. Okay. And then what is clinical anxiety? So again, let us understand that anxiety falls on a continuum, with normal worry on the one side of the continuum and clinical anxiety on the other side of the continuum. And it's normal that our children would worry that they have a test tomorrow. It's normal that our child will worry, if they go out, they might catch the virus, because the virus is an invisible threat. It's normal, for children to be worrying about such things, because that's a normal response to the stressor at hand. However, when that worry moves into the red zone and when it becomes clinical in nature, is when their worries start to impact their day-to-day functioning. The child doesn't want to go to school because they're worried about that test. The child doesn't want to go to that lesson anymore because they're worried about writing that test. The child can't fall asleep at night because they worry about writing that test. The child doesn't want to go to birthday parties anymore because they are worried about that test that they have to do in 2 weeks' time. So how are their worries starting to impact on their day-to-day functioning? We know that clinical anxiety is more severe and long-lasting. We know that there are major changes in the child's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And we know that they may experience excessive shame, guilt, or hopelessness. Okay. And so anxiety disorders are diagnosed when there is excessive nervousness, fear, apprehension, and worry. And we often have these children reporting physical difficulties as well. They may report that they're experiencing a sore stomach or a headache, or they may say that they're experiencing heart palpitations, so a lot of panic-like symptoms, nausea, difficulty breathing. And so that is when we know that this requires a more formal intervention. And what we know is that severe anxiety can significantly impact on a child's day-to-day functioning. And so some common signs of symptoms of anxiety disorders would be on the physical level. As I mentioned, we may see a few of these symptoms. We often also see constipation in children who experience anxiety. We see that they may experience headaches, numbness, muscle aches and pains. On the psychological front, what we see is that there may be indecisiveness, they may be feeling on edge, they may find themselves going blank in tests, they experience performance anxiety, they are quite forgetful in nature because they're not in the present moment. Because what we know about anxiety is that it's future-based. So the child is constantly thinking about the future. They are not grounded in the present moment. On a behavioral level, children who experience anxiety may display clingy behavior, they may display school refusal, they may be pulling out their hair because that is a self-soothing mechanism for them. They may be biting their nails or always crying. They may, often be asking to use the washroom. They may be experiencing sleeping difficulties. We know that in adolescence, some children are also self-medicating, which is a great concern. We know that some children are abusing substances, and that is a way that they are trying to cope with the anxiety that they're experiencing, which we know would just exacerbate the symptoms. And this is something that I would like to draw your attention to, is that, as I mentioned earlier, mental health illnesses are invisible to the eye. And often we may miss that a child may be struggling because they are so high functioning. We sometimes find that the kids who are excelling in school and who are doing great things out there are often the ones struggling with anxiety. And so it is often masked as them being the star student. We may look at this kid and think, wow, this child does so well at school. Meantime, it's being experienced by them as this fear of failure. The child may come forward as being so easygoing. Meantime, the child may fear rejection. The child may be seen as the class clown, always making jokes, always making light of things. Meantime, the child is desperately seeking approval, desperately seeking attention. And so they have a very low self-esteem. The child may come across as flawless, never makes any mistakes. Meantime, the child is struggling with their relationship with perfectionism. They may perform well under pressure. Meantime, the child is constantly seeking approval. Or they are, children that are, very shy. They may be overthinking, okay? So how do we recognize the signs of anxiety or depression during COVID-19? What we need to understand is that we may be working with kids online, and so it's very difficult for us to read how the child is doing. So it's important that we look at any significant changes in the child's appearance. We look at whether or not they're refusing to turn their video on. We look at them making careless mistakes with their schoolwork, poor impulse control with their phones, talking or posting about death, dying, or not feeling well, being over-responsive, being under-responsive, wearing pajamas late into the day. So these are just some of the symptoms that we're looking out for online. And how do we safeguard our children's mental health? We know that adequate sleep is key, and we know that we need to address the physical body first. So if it is that a child is struggling with mental health difficulties, it's important that they're getting their 8 to 9 to 10 to 11 hours of sleep a night, depending on their age, that they are exercising. We cannot stress the importance of exercise, that they are moving and hydrating their bodies and eating healthily. It's important that we broaden our children's emotional vocabulary, that we give them more words to be able to express themselves, because we know that majority of individuals only know 3 emotions: happy, sad, and angry. So we really need to look at broadening their emotional vocabulary by introducing them to feelings charts, to educational games that lean in the direction of emotional intelligence and building that as a soft skill. It's important that we model appropriate emotional regulation to our kids, because we cannot be a container to our children if we ourselves are struggling to regulate our own emotions. Because we know that children's frontal lobes, the part of the brain that's responsible for emotional regulation, is only fully developed at age 24, 25. And so the parent in their environment needs to be that surrogate frontal lobe to the child. You need to be the container to help your child deal with these difficult emotions. If you are experiencing anxiety, the child is going to pick up on that because they're sensitive to our feelings as well. And we can communicate to one another on a non-verbal level. It's called emotional contagion. And so it's a psychological phenomenon where we're able to transfer emotions non-verbally to one another. So it's important that parents are also paying attention to your own emotional pain, your own triggers, healing that first, and also just creating a platform for your child to speak. And so I'm going to share a bit about that in a moment. But around emotional hygiene, I would suggest Googling the feelings wheel on Google, because you can then introduce your child to a richer emotional vocabulary, because a child needs to know the difference between feeling irritated versus feeling frustrated, feeling angry versus feeling annoyed, feeling sad versus feeling disappointed. Because if they know the difference between these feelings, it's easier for them to process these emotions that they're experiencing. So very important that we build the child's emotional vocabulary. And um, I, so I will also share some examples of how we can do that shortly. How do we give our children that space to be able to speak? How do we create that platform for meaningful conversations with the child? And what we know is that all children have an emotional tank. And so if that tank is not filled with positive love and attention, the child will either act out or withdraw. And so it's really important that we try to carve out 10 to 15 minutes a day of one-on-one quality time with our children, where we are ditching our phones, where we're making positive eye contact with our children, where we are asking them how has their day been, really just connecting with them, because that has shown to really help the child feel seen and heard. And to label the time that you spend with your child, to say it's mommy and Jake time, so that when Jake gets into bed that night, he remembers that he had his one-on-one time with his mom, right? Or with dad. And so very important that we are making time for our children, which is free of the phone. And giving your child permission to feel all of their feelings. There should be a bumper sticker in everybody's home that says, all feelings are accepted, but not all behaviors. And so a child is allowed to feel angry. They're allowed to feel sad. They're allowed to feel worried. Giving them space to feel these feelings is really important, because they will grow up to be adults who then know what it is that they're feeling and not being dismissive of their feelings. And so also getting a child to focus on what is within their control as opposed to focusing on what is not within their control. Limit their caffeine intake. I cannot stress the importance of this, because we know that these caffeine stimulants are exacerbating symptoms of anxiety in our children. Red Bull is a drink that should be banned. And the reason I say this is because it is sold freely on the market, and it is the number one drink that is legal. Children are drinking it so that they can stay awake throughout the night and so that they can study for their tests. But what we're finding is that it is exacerbating symptoms of anxiety. So just being aware of what your child is putting into their body, having healthy boundaries with their phones, having a charge station outside of the room in the evenings, that they don't go to bed with their phones, because we know that they're spending more and more time online. And the blue light that emanates from the phone is the same light that surgeons use in theater when they're operating on a patient at 2 a.m. in the morning. That same light is signaling to the surgeon, do not fall asleep. That same light emanates from the child's smartphone, which delays the release of melatonin, the sleep hormone responsible for getting a child to go into that deep sleep cycle. So if your child is spending time online before they get into bed, it's going to impact their sleep. It's going to impact the quality of their sleep, which is then going to impact their ability to perform the next day and to be able to concentrate in the classroom. So very important that we look at sleep hygiene, that we're practicing mindfulness with our kids, that we're spending that quality time. And if it is that these symptoms persist, do not go at it alone. Have it checked out. Get your child into sign your child up for an emotional assessment with a psychologist, because it's important that we address that and that we do not leave it so that it spirals into something worse. Because we know that untreated anxiety can spiral into depression. Untreated depression can spiral into anxiety. So these two disorders often work hand in hand. And how to respond to a child with empathy. So it's important that we stand in a position of curiosity and empathy with our children, as opposed to standing in a position of judgment and knowing. So when your child comes to you and they say that they're feeling worried, it's important that you can sit with them and ask them, what's all of this been like for you? Tell me more about what that's been like for you. Have you ever felt these strong feelings before? What can I do to help you? As opposed to saying to them, come on, it's not such a big deal. It's okay, don't worry. Because parents who have the best intentions can sometimes come off as quite dismissive of their child's feelings. When your child comes to you and says they're feeling worried about their test, a parent will quickly say, don't worry, it's okay. You're going to work harder in the next test. Meantime, that's very dismissive of what the child is actually experiencing. So you want to acknowledge and validate the child's feelings first before moving into problem solving, or before saying things like, don't worry, because the child is feeling worried. And in their world, it is a big worry. So you want to stop. You want to name the emotion that they're experiencing, because that helps broaden their emotional vocabulary. You want to be able to say, I can see you feeling quite angry right now. I can see you feeling quite worried right now. Do you want to tell me more about that? So being curious with your child helps with fueling connection and deepening those meaningful conversations. And if you're interested in learning more about child mental health and how you can learn to respond to a child who is struggling with a mental health difficulty, we have 2 courses available at the LightHouse Arabia: the Adult to Adolescent Mental Health First Aid Training, where an adult can be a first responder to a child who is developing a mental health difficulty or he is already in crisis. So you learn how to detect the signs and symptoms of the mental health difficulty and how to approach the child, how to get them the appropriate professional support. And we also have the teen-to-teen mental health first aid training, which teaches teens how to respond to their peers who are struggling with a mental health difficulty. Both of these courses are available at the LightHouse. We are doing them online at the moment. So you can have a look at our websites for that. I want to quickly move into sharing with you some resources. We have a few Instagram platforms where we're sharing pertinent, relevant information around child mental health and parent mental health and well-being, as well as parenting strategies. So at the LightHouse on Instagram, we have 2 platforms for parents known as at Lighthearted Parenting. And then we also have at Smart Heart Board Game, which is a board game created by a psychologist, which aims at facilitating emotional intelligence in kids, and it helps to broaden the child's emotional vocabulary. This game is available for purchase at LightHouse Arabia. You can go and check out these different Instagram accounts if you'd like to learn more about these topics at hand, and you'd like to gain more skills in your parenting and add more tools to your toolbox, because on a day-to-day basis we're sharing tips on these platforms. We also have at LightHouse Arabia and at Dr. Salia Afridi, which are 2 Instagram accounts geared at adults and helping adults on their own healing journeys. And then we have the youth account at LightHouse Insight, which is geared at assisting teens, and it gives teens tips and tools around their own coping strategies and how to deal with stresses and how to deal with relationships in life. So you're welcome to check out these different platforms if you're interested in learning more. Now I'm going to take some time for some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to ask you to please pop your questions into the chat, and I will address them shortly. So association with physical illness could be aversion to vomiting. This is not the source of the anxiety, but the anxiety is causing the aversion. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, that if a child is experiencing vomiting, what we know is that vomiting can be a symptom of anxiety, or it can be that the child has a physical issue at hand, and when they do vomit, they then can develop anxiety because there's a fear of them going out in public, and what if I vomit again? And so the child can often, and I've dealt with a few cases like this, where children actually develop anxiety around being in public because they fear that next episode where they do feel sick and they vomit. So these two can often go hand in hand. And what we know is that when a child is experiencing a great deal of stress, it can impact on their gastrointestinal functions. And so they may experience gastrointestinal issues, including vomiting. If a 12-year-old says, I want to kill myself at any time, is that serious? Is this instance it was once and was during an outburst of emotions? As a therapist, I take all talk of death, dying, suicide very seriously. Even if it was a cry for attention on the part of the child, it is still not an effective coping mechanism. And so if a child is saying, I want to kill myself, I'm thinking a few things. I'm thinking that the child is struggling to process the feelings that they're feeling at the moment. The child may be crying out for help. The child may not have the necessary emotional vocabulary to be able to express what it is that they're feeling in that moment. And the only thing they can think is that they would prefer to not be around. So either way, I would suggest that parents be proactive. I have a few friends who have their children in therapy, not because the child is experiencing a severe mental illness, but because the parents want to be proactive and they want to teach their children soft skills and they want to give their children a toolkit. And I often share with children that I work with that they have an imaginary toolbox, and that we look to fill their toolbox with effective coping strategies to deal with stresses in life. So we don't wait for the storm to arrive and then try and engage in some firefighting. We be proactive and we give our children soft skills so that when those storms arrive, they know how to navigate their way through it. It's because of online classes. Children are spending so much time on devices emitting blue light. How do we deal with it? I would say that it's not only because of online classes. I would say that one of the big issues here is that children are spending time on recreational technology, not educational technology. I don't have an issue with educational technology. I have more of an issue with recreational technology. These children are spending more and more time not only on their devices at school, but then they go home and they've got these smartphones in their pockets. And then these children are spending up to 7 hours a day on recreational technology. And so that for me is a bigger issue. And yes, I think blue light blocking glasses are critical in a time like this. OcuShield has got blue light screen protectors and blue light blocking glasses, so children can wear that. And I would suggest that you have firm boundaries in place in the home environment around technology, that technology is not ruling the child, but the child is learning how to control their relationship with technology. If you want to just learn about the effects of this, please watch the documentary Social Dilemma, because that will make you very aware of the effects that technology is having on our teens and on our kids in general. My 7-year-old would often burst out and cry over an issue rather than talk things through. Is this normal for his age, or is it a sign of anxiety? So there need to be a cluster of symptoms present in order to make a diagnosis of anxiety. But if it is that, the child is having many anger outbursts or crying outbursts, I think it would be necessary to be able to create a platform for meaningful conversations with your child, to broaden their emotional vocabulary. So the next time the child is having an outburst, perhaps it would be good to name it to tame it. Dan Siegel, who's a clinical professor from UCLA, speaks about the name it to tame it technique, which means that when we name the child's emotion that they're experiencing, it helps send soothing neurotransmitters from the higher parts of the brain to the limbic brain. And so when your child is having an outburst, it would be good to be able to say to your child, I can see that you're feeling quite angry right now, or I can see you feeling quite sad right now. Do you maybe want to draw that for me on a piece of paper? So helping the child externalize that feeling and then having a conversation about that feeling can go a very long way, because the child is not the problem is the problem. And when we externalize that anger or that anxiety, it makes it easier for the child to be able to deal with it. And so if it is that you have concerns about these crying outbursts, I would have it checked out. I think there is nothing wrong with getting your child to do an emotional assessment, just to see how do they deal with things present day, how are they coping, and again, to be proactive about teaching our kids soft skills. I'm just having a look here at all of these questions. My son loves war games and computers, and even playing physically. I've heard them say, kill, kill, kill. I'm alarmed. What can you advise? Well, I think it's really important that you are supervising the content of the games that your children are playing. And so the more time they're spending online, the more exposure they're going to have to these violent games. And I cannot tell parents, how they should manage their social media at home. Every parent has their own preference. Every parent has their own value system. But what I can say is that the more time children are spending online, there is an increased risk of anxiety and depression. And if it is that they are watching such violent games, that it is going to start playing out in their day-to-day interactions with others. And so you want to cancel that out by introducing soft skills in the home, where you are also maybe putting a values chart up in the home with different values that you have in place. And, explaining to the child that, when they say kill, 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 that goes against a value of sorts, a value of kindness, a value of humanity. So I would look into how much time the child is spending online. My 13-year-old son likes to joke about suicide and death a lot. He thinks it's funny, but should I be concerned? Is he masking his true feelings? So if it is that your child is speaking about, suicide and death, I think it would be helpful to have a conversation with them, just from a standpoint also of him learning how to develop compassion and understanding how, suicide is not something to be joked about, and how that can really, if he's in a crowd of people and he jokes about suicide, that can really be upsetting for others. And so just explaining to him that it is a serious topic, and, I would suggest creating a space to have a conversation with him about it, to be curious. Again, stand in a position of curiosity with your child and say, you've spoken a few times about suicide. How did you come to learn about suicide? What do you know about suicide? What ideas do you have about suicide? And do not fear the topic, because research has shown that it is a myth that if we speak to our kids about suicide, we are planting a seed. It is an absolute myth. And so the more we speak about these things, the more we educate our children about it. Because would your child rather hear it from you, their parent, or would you like them to hear it from their friend on the playground? I would think you would want them to hear it from you. So there are many topics that parents are fearful of going into and speaking about. It may be topics around pornography. It may be topics around sex education. Again, would you like your children to hear it from their peers on the playground, or would you like your child to hear it from you? And so often we need to think about these things, and we need to think about how we address it with our children. Right, I have time for one more question. I'm just having a look here at ones that we haven't addressed yet. How do I address my teen getting into rude arguments? How do I address my teen getting rude with me in arguments? Well, it depends. It depends how you are going about disciplining them. And if it is that they are being rude to you in arguments, there needs to be a consequence for that. And often the consequence that works best is the one where you withdraw a privilege, and that privilege is often their smartphone. I find that works very well. And so if it is that your child is being rude, I would anchor it in, I would engage in values-driven parenting as opposed to rules-driven parenting. And so when your child is rude to you in a conversation, I would have a values chart up. And on the values chart, you can have the value of respect, kindness, trust, love, generosity, gratitude. All of these values can be on the chart. And when your child is rude to you, you can say that I'm grounding you because you're going against the core value in our home, which is the value of kindness and respect. And so your smartphone will be taken away from you for the next 2 days. And so, and I would communicate these terms and conditions up front to the child. I wouldn't just ground them and take away their phone. I would have a conversation with your child now and say that I've been thinking about things. I don't like the way you sometimes speak with me or with your siblings. And so we're going to have a consequence in place for every time that happens. If you do speak disrespectfully to me, your phone will be taken away for 48 hours. And so I'm telling you now that that is going to happen. And then it's so important that you follow through with that. So children are going to push you as far as they can. If you allow them to treat you badly or you allow them to be disrespectful towards you, they will continue. If there isn't a consequence in place, they will continue. And children need boundaries. The more boundaries there are in place, the more safe and secure a child actually feels. And the more safe and secure the child feels, the more confident they are to step out into the world and to do the things that they need to do. So don't be scared to set boundaries with your kids. And I speak a lot about these topics on our Instagram platforms at Lighthearted Parenting and at Smart Heart Board Game. So feel free to take a look at those platforms to learn more about that. This brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you all for your active participation, and I wish you all a lovely week further. Take care. Bye-bye.